Well, how about we start off?
Tell me, Nico, what is your dream build on a 4A, 7A engine?
All right, so we've got a bit of a unique opportunity here. Matt and I don't really spend much time in the car together, other than when we were in America and we had like a 20-hour road trip each way. So I figured, well, it was actually Matt's idea that we turn the camera on and maybe have a bit of a chat, because I guess every time I talk to Matt, we have a lot of phone conversations. I always learn something. And every time I listen to him on the phone, I think, man, like this is just killer information. I should have this recorded somehow. So
you don't record the phone conversations?
No, I don't record the phone. So
get onto that. Write that down.
We've got about an hour drive here, so I thought it's not difficult or you thought as well, it's not difficult to turn the camera on, put some microphones on, and just have a chat. So we were just saying that maybe we'll start the conversation off talking about how if we had like no budget, what we would do to do like a aspirated 4A, like our perfect aspirated 4A setup. And it's funny that Matt and I are both right into 4A GEs, but we've got completely different ideas on what would be like the ultimate motor. Like for me personally, what I would do is I'd go for a 7A block, and I'd want to go for a stroker crank. So go 2 litre 7A block with a big port head. I'd have all my TRD parts, dry sump, the TRD cam cover, throttle bodies. I love those TRD throttle bodies that I bought in America with like the fuel rail at the top.
Yeah, you like seeing the fuel rail.
They're so hot. And then I drew a lot of inspiration from Merle's engine. So for anyone that doesn't know, Matt built an engine for a friend of ours up in America who's got an Atlantic race car that he drove on Pikes Peak. And his valves, he's got like 4mm oversized valves. They're like a custom valve. I'd have to go for that. I'd have to go for some beryllium copper seats.
Yeah.
Beryllium copper is something that we should probably talk about as well.
Yeah.
So I do port work, like port the head to within an inch of its life.
Where it gets, where we get the most out of it.
2 litre stroker. And I remember you were also talking about, like I was always talking about just buying an off the shelf stroker crank. You're always talking about marine cranks do the best cranks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it would probably be a marine crank, dry sump, 2 litre, titanium rod. Wiseco piston, high compression. I probably would just go E85 full time.
Yeah.
Oversized valves, 4mm oversized. Port work. I really like the port work that you done for me on my current 7A.
Yeah.
And it's all hand ported.
Yep.
But you keep raving on about the port work that you can get done CNC these days, like a really nice CNC port job. So I'd just do whatever you'd recommend.
Yeah, I mean, look, we could digitize your port work on your current head. Yeah. And then the CNC can replicate that.
But like one of the things, the reason I didn't really like the port work whenever I seen CNC porting, it was always on a turbo motor, and then the channel that separates the two ports is always blunt.
Yeah.
With my one, it's been sharpened.
Sharpened right up.
But then you said that's the option that you chose, was to blunt that.
Yes. So it's a heat factor thing.
Yeah.
So the sharper it is, the more the air gets cut as the air comes in. But the problem is you get heat building up on that fine edge, that sharp edge. That's not really good for turbocharged setups, because it does tend to get quite hot. With a blunt edge on that port divider, you tend to not build up the same amount of heat. The head can transfer the heat from the air into the cylinder head and then into the cooling jacket. So
that's what always put me off about the CNC work. I mean, I've always seen turbo stuff.
Yeah, in aspirated, I mean, it's better because the heat isn't there. You're not compressing the air, making it hot.
And having that sharp edge.
Yeah, the sharp edge. Yeah. I mean, look, on a side note, we were just talking about my mate Rob at Cranked Motorsports. He just had his GDR at GDR Fest. They've built that car to run deep into the 6s and potentially a 5-second. That's their goal, is to be a 5-second all-wheel drive GDR R32. Yeah. I've done the cylinder head on that. That's all hand ported.
Oh, right.
So that made, I think it took me about 2 days worth of porting. That made 1,700 horsepower, incredibly rich on methanol at 70 pounds of boost. So it's still got another 30 pounds of boost to go before it's, on the upper end of the boost that they're going to put in it, which is like 100, 110. So they've got between 30 and 40 pounds more to go. That engine should well and truly make into the 2,500 plus horsepower range. Yeah. But they were very impressed with the way that the head actually reacted on the dyno. They were very impressed. They said
the power would ramp up quickly because of the port work.
Yeah, well, they just said the airspeed was really good. They said compared to CNC port programs that they use, like what I got on Tarek's car, they said that, I mean, obviously this is no secret, the bigger you go in the ports, you start to lose airspeed. Even in a turbocharged car, but it's getting up onto the turbo is the hardest part. So his car
getting
comes
up on boost.
getting up onto it.
Yeah.
Obviously his car is very different. It's an automatic staging drag car. So you stage all your horsepower at the start line. But even in saying that, you're still, even in a Pro Tree, if you know what a drag Pro Tree is, when you stage on the two lights, it's like 3 lights green. So it's like 2 stage, 3 lights, go flash at once, and then it's green. So you have to be very quick to get up onto the converter, very quick to get up onto boost and launch, get it prepared for launch. So having that airspeed is a bit critical. And like you say,
a lot of the GTR guys, doesn't the clock start when they take off? So they just take their time to build boost and they just go whenever?
When you're not in a racing condition, when you're just looking to get a time, you don't care when the tree drops. The timer only starts when you leave the line. So,
but if it's actual like a proper race,
racing,
you've got to be ready.
You've got to. Just running a time is one thing, but then in a racing scenario, you've got to be able to stage that car and then bring it into the beams, and then the Pro Tree will drop. There's also dirty tactics in drag racing where you can hold off on someone who's already pulled into stage and they're already on anti-lag and they're already staged, and if you just hold out and let them melt their engine down, you essentially just wait as long as possible, and then you come in after 10 seconds of them staged, their engine's already literally melting down. So there's dirty tactics you can do in drag racing. Not saying that I would do anything like that, but
people do.
People do that in racing,
But
whatever it takes to win.
Anyway, that's like, say, we both talk about this a lot, so that's what I would do if I had no budget. I'd got no clue what kind of power it make, but for me, that's the best option. As far as like because my cars are street cars. I want
wet
low
sump,
to mid-range torque. Dry sump.
Oh, you want a dry sump, of course.
But low to mid-range torque. I like the dry sump just because it has that. You were explaining it to me before. It creates a vacuum
inside the crankcase.
You suck the piston down.
Well, it creates a vacuum, and in a vacuum, weight isn't the same. If you actually, I've mentioned it to you, but if you actually Google search what happens in a vacuum where they drop a bowling ball and a feather inside a vacuum chamber, and I think it's like 100 feet high, and they suck this chamber into the same vacuum that space has in space, and basically you would think the bowling ball would fall faster than the feather. It doesn't. They actually fall at the same rate. So if you consider that weight is reduced in a vacuum, well then think about what's happening with a crankshaft spinning and rods and pistons reciprocating. Like the weight doesn't become as much of an issue, so you essentially make not like a weightlessness environment, but you really do help the reciprocating and rotating mass inside that crankcase.
Like breathing issues, like having to put all the breathers on your cam cover. With the dry sump, you're explaining as well. Your catch can's what breathes, not the actual cam cover. So you can put all your vents and everything on the catch can, and you just run that
the dry sump tank
cover, and that'd be sick.
So the oil gets sucked out of the engine, put into a tank, and then you draw from that tank. It's essentially like a surge tank for your oil, like in a fuel system.
So like that's my ultimate setup. So if I won the lotto, but like say if you won the lotto, what would you do? Because it's funny that we both respect each other's ideas, but they're completely different. So your ideal 4A would be different.
I'm big into, obviously I'm turbocharged, right? I like the idea of high RPM. I really do want to try and build an engine that just literally it revs. I'd love to go to like 14,000 RPM, but the only way you're going to do that is like your dry sump system. I really do like long rods and short stroke, because what the limiting factor at some point becomes the rod angle. As you start to increase your stroke, the rod goes too far out from the center line of the crankshaft, and that essentially makes the rod buckle and snap and then want to go out the side. So if you can reduce your stroke and have a really tall rod, essentially your rod doesn't travel in this monster action. It sort of moves up and down, but it doesn't really get the same rod angle. So the rod stroke ratio is something I keep down, and basically I would just have monster RPM. I'd like something that rev to like 13,000 RPM. I'm looking already my new engine that I want to build after the engine that's going into this car after the next one. Obviously you've seen they would have seen at this point the build series on the 800 horsepower engine. The next one I would like to do would be well and truly over 1,000 horsepower, and it would be a 7A block, a 16 valve head, so I'll get rid of the 20 valve engine, I'll go back to a 16 valve. And that's because I can get the valve spring in it that I want. And you can get your 4mm oversized valves, and you can do all that racy stuff. It's not as, I don't think I think the 20 valves is a sexier looking engine. It's more sleek and it's more modern looking. The cam covers and in general.
But it has limitations.
But it has its limitations, and really I'm pushing it on the 800 horsepower setup, I think, to keep a longevity of an engine going. I just don't have the spring pressure to run the boost that I want to run, and I'm going to be running over 50, 60 pounds of boost, even more potentially in that engine. But because of the limitations of, say, gearbox, at that sort of RPM, you physically cannot shift the gear.
Yeah.
Like the synchromesh gears cannot shift at like 10,000 RPM.
But you don't have that problem.
I don't have that problem with the dog box.
Yeah.
So
that's a big reason why. Well, there's multiple reasons why I would go for a Stroker 2-litre 7A, was because I don't want to have to rebuild my engine every, 10 hours or something?
10 hours wide open throttle,
So I don't want to be pulling my engine in and out of the car constantly.
Yeah.
And on the street, how often am I going to rev it out to 10,000, 11,000?
Yeah.
Very rarely. So driving a car on the street, you want low to mid-range torque. So that's why a bigger displacement motor would suit me.
Yeah, more torque down low.
But a high revving engine would suit you.
Yeah,
So,
look, like you say, the higher revving engine has more, there's a lot more wear and tear. There's a lot more maintenance that goes involved in that. Again, going back to, like, say, Rob's engine, that motor would come out after like 12 passes, and it gets new rods, and it gets new, aluminium rods and all that sort of stuff.
But you're the engine guy. You do all that yourself.
Right. Yeah, that's right. I can do it myself. It does become costly. I want to try and build an engine that I can do that, that sort of RPM and boost and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, I still want to try and get some usability out of it where I can actually drive the car.
Yep.
Like you say, that block would be completely filled to the brim with concrete. I'd only have water running through the cylinder head to keep it cool. CDI ignition system, which is going into the car very soon. I have it all there. I just got to put it in and wire it and all that.
Yep.
It'd have, dual injectors at that point.
So CDI coils.
CDI ignition system, two sets of injectors. I'd probably have like a 1400cc ID for my lower injector, and then a 2600 on the high one.
Yep. But you would do a similar setup if you went aspirated. So if you went and built an aspirated motor, you would still do a 7A. And I was going to say, in order to get a long rod setup, you need a taller 7A block. But then run a 4A crank, and then a longer rod, a longer rod to suit that. So that's how you would do it.
That's how I would do it. Yeah. And to keep cost down further again, I wouldn't be trying to move the gudgeon pin further up into the connecting rod. Into the piston.
Into the piston, yeah.
I'd run a standard, not a standard, but an off-the-shelf pin height on the gudgeon pin in the piston.
Okay.
And I would run, I can't remember the exact measurement off the top of my head, but I think it's a 155 or a 157 mil length rod, center to center. And that way, essentially, I'm only running a factory stroke crankshaft, and I'm running the factory piston, but the rod is the custom item there.
Okay.
And like you say, if the titanium rod was able to do the power that I'm looking to do, I'd probably go with the tie rod, but they are quite expensive compared to, say, an alloy rod.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of companies in America that make aluminium rods, and I've sort of been talking back and forward with them, trying to see if I can get it to fit down the actual bore of the motor, because realistically I want to try and keep the bore small. I want to keep it 81.5, which is half a mil over factory.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of looking at options, seeing which direction I can go, and like you say, I'd obviously have to convert to dry sump system, which also entails a bit more cost.
Yeah. But going back to what I said earlier, if you were to build an aspirated motor, it would be very similar.
Oh yeah. Again, because of the gearbox limitation.
Okay, but say if it was aspirated, could you get away with the valve spring pressure on a 20 valve if you went for a high RPM aspirated motor?
No.
You want to go 16?
Yeah, I'd still probably go 16 valve. So one of the things that I found in the 20 valves is to get the sort of power and that you want out of the high horsepower aspirator. I mean, you can do it. It's been done plenty of times. Speed racer sports cars. Chris Barry used to do it back in the Clubmans back in the day. 240 horsepower crank, no problem, on a 20 valve 7A stroker. You're talking over 15 years ago. Like 20 years ago now, even he was doing those. Which was an offset ground factory crankshaft with a custom Argo rod and a custom Wiseco piston. You get 2 litres out of it. 1.950cc. And then MRP came along and made the billet crankshaft with his own rod combination and piston combination. But it's all the same stuff. It's just essentially offset grinding the factory 7A shaft, because the journal diameter is so massive. When you actually grind it down to 42mm crank journal, you just move you're offsetting the grind. So you're making the 7A 1.8 crankshaft essentially a 1.950. But obviously the billet crankshaft's far superior. The oiling system's better. It's billet. And you get to add that counter mass into the crankshaft, so you can actually get that harmonic right.
And also just to clear it up for anyone that is sort of struggling to keep up as to why the 20 valve springs are limit. So because the valve springs in a 20 valve are quite small, you can only get them up to a height, like the pressure that you want is not available.
The spring pressure.
That's the limitation. When you get to higher RPM, a higher lift crankshaft, more duration. Camshaft. You want a heavier spring.
You need a heavier spring,
so that you don't get valve float.
So the valve float is essentially when the valve returns to the seat as the lobe comes off the bucket. When the valve actually returns back to the seat, the valve will bounce off the seat. Now that you lose all your cylinder pressure control, and you can eventually tap a valve with your piston and then it bends it and it causes chaos. So you really need the spring pressure. Once you lose valve stability, you lose the engine.
So
is that turning, the camera turning?
Maybe a little bit. So we'll check on it in a second. I was always under the impression, like obviously before I met you, like he's like, they won't shut up.
It sounded like you were smoking. You were like
it sounded like a sigh.
A big sigh.
These guys are still going.
I wasn't listening.
For the listeners, we've got my missus coming today. She took the day off work sick.
Oh, don't say that.
When her bosses see it, they'll rage. You're like, what the fuck?
But anyway, so before I met you, I was always under the impression that if you're going to keep a standard 4A, the best one you can, so as far as a standard engine goes, 20 valves is going to make the most power. And then the 16 valve, the small port, is probably the pinnacle of the 16 valves. But if you wanted to build an engine, I was always under the impression it didn't matter. But after talking to you about valve spring pressures and stuff, it seems like it actually does matter, and 16 valve is superior because you've got more options.
Way more options.
So if you're going to keep it standard, 20 valve 100% is probably the best.
Blacktop easily.
And you've got throttle bodies from factory. It's really it's a good engine. But if you have dreams and aspirations of doing something silly like you and me, then you kind of want a 16 valve. Now I'm leaning more towards a big port 16 valve to suit my throttles that I've bought, but also bigger ports. We're going to be putting the
big Formula Oversized valves in it. Needs them.
Because right now with my 7A, I'm running a small port head, and I never really thought it made much difference. Once you port it within an inch of its life, it doesn't really matter. Whether you go big port or a small port for it. Would you say that if you're going to build a really high strung aspirated 4A, you'd be better off with a big port?
I honestly think at some point what happens is you're going to hit a wall at the small port with the valve size. So think about this, right? If you measure the valve size in a 4A, it's perfectly suited for a 1.6 litre engine. But when you start looking at 2 litre engines like a 4G63, an SR20, any of these 2 litre turbocharged engines, or even the aspirated 2 litre aspirated Japanese engines, look at the valve size in them. The valve size and the port size is proportional into the cubic inch size of the engine. So when we've got guys that are doing 7A conversions, they're going from 1.6 to 1.8, but they're retaining the factory port and valve. I've done this with plenty of customers, and I tell them, honestly, cams are good, but put some valves in it. Port the valve, even if you don't port the port, and you just put oversized valves in and you cut the seat so you actually get the benefits of the flow from the valve, you see huge differences. And like you say, from what we saw out of Merle's engine, because when I got it, I assumed that it just had Formula Atlantic valves in it, which you buy from Supertech.
Yeah.
How wrong was I? So those valves are only 2 millimeters oversized, but in actual fact, Merle's had 4 millimeter oversized valves. Very close, very similar in size to your SR20s and your 4G63s, your K20s, all that sort of stuff. So realistically, when you start going up to these bigger cubic inch stroker engines, you need to put valves in.
Yeah.
At some point, you'll lose. Like if you could put Formula oversized valves in a 1.6 litre, but I don't think it's going to work. So you know what I mean? Like you just have to test it.
Right. So on that note, if you're going to go for a stroker, or I would even argue if you're going to go high RPM, you want to go oversized valve.
Yep.
Now, oversizing your valve is all well and good up until a point, but then you will run out of valve seat, and then you're going to have to replace.
Put valve seats.
You're going to have to replace your valve seat. So that's when the price goes from I'm just going to upgrade the valves to like, okay, now we're going to spend a lot of money on machine work.
Thousands.
I think it was like $2,000 to put new seats in or something, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, like last time we checked.
Yeah.
And so new seats, and then if you're going to put new seats in, depending on the type of valve that you're running, for me being an aspirated guy, like I'd like to run a titanium valve. So lightweight, it's fucking cool. And to suit titanium, the best thing we were talking about before would be beryllium copper.
Yep.
So do you want to talk about beryllium copper seats? Obviously, you know, unobtainium, super expensive beryllium copper seats, but like that's what the best of the best, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So essentially what happens is when you've got a hard nickel seat, now a little bit of history on it, back in the days of super fuel where we had lead in the fuel, which was toxic to humans, the reason they put lead in the fuel was to keep the combustion from melting the valves and seats out of cylinder heads back in the day. So all of a sudden we realized, the human race realized that burning lead was bad for the people. Like we were getting killed and getting all sorts of problems from burning lead.
Diseases.
So they moved on to material quality, and because technology had moved further forwards, we realized that hardened nickel seats didn't cop the issues that required lead to be in the fuel. So we went to unleaded, hence the term unleaded fuel. So now every single car on the road has hard nickel seats in it. Now, nickel seats are amazing, but they're hard. So when the valve shuts against them, it's like slamming a door shut with the knob stuck. If we slam it and it hits hard timber, it'll bound back. If you have a soft door jamb and you slam the door into it, it'll absorb that impact. So think of the beryllium like a sponge. When you have a soft beryllium seat, when the valve closes against it, even if you have lower spring pressure, so ideally what you want to do is, it's a balancing act. If you have too much valve spring pressure, what happens is the valve will hit the seat on a hard nickel seat, and it can still bounce off depending on how hard the valve is and how hard the seat is.
Yep.
So what you do is you remove some valve spring pressure, because more valve spring pressure means more parasitic loss. The engine horsepower gets drained just turning the valve train over.
Yep.
So you want to try and minimize as much valve spring pressure as possible. If you've got 200 pounds of spring pressure when 100 will do, you're wasting horsepower in valve spring.
Yeah.
So what you can do is on a beryllium seat, you can actually reduce your valve spring pressure, so you remove the parasitic loss.
Without going into valve flow.
Without going to valve flow, and you can run that less spring pressure. So ideally in aspirated race cars, and we used to do this all the time, we actually had customers when I was an apprentice, and he used to have, we measured a cylinder head for him, and when we'd done all these valve, like his valve train geometry on his cylinder head, it was literally for a vintage race car. Like this thing was old as hell. It was like an overhead rocker arrangement, and you could, when you take the cam cover off, you just unbolt the rocker arrangement. It was there in front of you. It's an inline 4 engine. It's like a mini moke or something.
Yep.
Basically what we had done is we had set up his valve spring pressure as hard as we could get it, with the valve train that he had with shims, and then basically we had written a diagram for him showing that how many shims he removed gave him what spring pressure. So if you remove, like let's say he had a stack of 6 shims under his valves, and if he removed one, it would drop it from say 75 spring pressure down to like 72.
Okay.
Remove one more, it'd go to 68. Now what he would do at the racetrack is he would go out and cut laps, and then he would come in, remove one shim, and then he'd go out and do it again, and he would increase his time because there was less parasitic loss on the engine, so he's making more horsepower.
Right.
So he was trying to maximise his horsepower in this historic series where you can't really do much. You can't add turbochargers, nitrous, you can't do any of that. So the best thing you can do, and I'm pretty sure you couldn't import the head. Like it literally had to.
Yeah,
so he was trying to maximise horsepower with keeping to the rules. And the best way to do that one of the ways that he found was friction reduction or torque, like, you know, parasitic loss reduction.
Right.
So remove shims until the engine would valve float. So he would get down to like one shim and all of a sudden valve float. He'd hit the straight and it'd just lay over on the straight and he's just like, oh, valve float. So he put one shim back in and that was the fastest the car could be.
Cool.
So that's giving you an idea of what a beryllium seat can help you do, is run that extra spring pressure. Yeah. If you need it.
Yeah, man.
We'll bleep that out what town we're in.
we're going to stop for some breakfast now, and yeah, we'll probably, if you guys like this kind of a video, we'll do it again. Yeah, we can do more videos like this because it's great getting information from a guy like that. It's always very informative and entertaining. So
yeah, it depends on how much the information they want to know. I can go pretty deep.
You can go deep. Yeah, you and I have gone deep a few times. So
don't say that. They already think we're gay. Fucking hell. My missus has been in the back seat of my wife. I'm married, right?
We've had people think that we're gay. But I'll put the comment up on the screen if I can find it.
Not gay.
Not gay.
Oh no. Just flash. Not gay. Not gay.
But if you guys do like this kind of video, put it down in the comments. Let us know what you think, and yeah, if you do like it,
soon.
we'll keep doing some more. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys.